My name is Austin Williams, Director of the Future Cities Project. Apologies if I'm repeating myself. Welcome to the Bookshop Barney. My co-host is Mo Lovett there, who was just shouting at me. And we're going to be discussing Paul Embery's book, this book, Despised, Why the Radical Left Loathes the Working Class. It's a very good turnout tonight, and I didn't realize I was that popular, I have to say. Just to say as well, the next Barney is on the 15th of April, 1 month's time, discussing this book by Robert Toombs, which is This Sovereign Isle, Britain in and out of Europe. It's just coincidentally a kind of a Brexit moment going on here, but just accidental. The purpose of the Barney in general is for the author to convince you to read the book. You don't have to read it in advance. And this book, Despised, is thoroughly recommended. You know what they say about a book about socialism? They say it's a huge red flag to some people. But this is an important read, and we'll flash up the Amazon link occasionally for you to click through on, and also for you to acclimatize to conditions after lockdown. We want to ease you into paying for things. So if you fancy making a donation to the Future Cities Project, you'll thank us later, and a link will be available in the chat. So we're discussing Despised by Paul Embery. He was a leading voice for the left-wing case for Brexit, which the left wing weren't keen on listening to. He's a firefighter, a trade union activist. He's a Blue Labour commentator, and he moonlights as a Prince Harry lookalike. And one other biographical note is that Paul is from Barking in Dagenham, which features quite heavily in the book. Barking in Dagenham. Some people say he's a little bit Dagenham. Some people say he's a little bit Basildon. Actually, Momentum say that he's dangerous. And the Daily Mirror says that he's lucid, angry, and brave. So you can decide by the end of the evening. One thing I would say is that this is a genuinely uncomfortable read in the best sense of the word, because it really makes you confront your own prejudices and really makes you think. So the way the Barney works is that Paul will give a 5-minute intro, but I'll take some questions, maybe 2, 3, 4, to see how many hands we get, and we'll take them in order. And then Paul can address, the themes of those questions, not on each one in turn, and then we'll come back out for more. So please, if you could maybe unmute at this moment and give Paul a rousing round of applause, that would be very, very kind. Okay, that's more than enough. Okay, Paul, so again, apologies to everybody to be authoritarian, but if you could all mute, that would be greatly appreciated, just because the Zoom doesn't work particularly well when it's noise in the background. So over to you, Paul, if you would.
Okay, thanks, Austin. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming along. So, what's the book about? For those who haven't read it, well, the book focuses really on what I consider to be a very serious disconnect that has emerged between, on the one hand, the Labour Party and the wider left, and on the other hand, the working class. And it goes some way to explaining how this disconnect occurred. It looks at the values of the modern left and how, in many cases, they are out of sync with the values of millions of ordinary working class voters. And as Austin touched on, it's written very much from my own vantage point, really, as somebody who's been actively involved in the Labour movement for 26 years, member of the Labour Party, an active trade unionist. And I think it's fair to say it was a disconnect that I saw coming, and it's something that I'd written about, and it's something that I had predicted. It explains how the Labour Party now is largely a party of social activists and student radicals and middle-class liberals living in our fashionable cities, and no longer really looks very much or sounds very much like millions of working class people living in post-industrial and provincial Britain. And it traces this disconnect to about 30 years ago, when I think the Labour Party started to embrace really a toxic brew of radical social and economic liberalism. And I think as the party's own demographic has changed, I think so has its priorities. So, the party on the wider left focuses less and less these days on bread and butter class-based issues, socio-economic injustices, and more on middle-class activist pursuits. And I think the immersion of the left generally into the politics of identity politics has been very damaging and very destructive to the left. And I think that the crucial thing is, when you speak to working class people, if you're a campaigner on the left, you have to talk about the things that they want to talk about as much as the things that you want to talk about. And I think the left is not good at that and has been increasingly worse at doing that. Sometimes the working class want to talk about issues that the left is not particularly comfortable about talking about, you know, law and order and immigration and national security. And issues like family and so on, as well as economic issues. And sometimes when those issues come up, I see Labour activists kind of stare down at the ground and shuffle their feet in embarrassment. They're much happier talking about identity politics and Palestine and climate change and gender identity. And I'm not suggesting there isn't a place for those sorts of debates on the left. There clearly is, but they're not the front and centre debates in the lives of ordinary working class people. And I also talk in the book about how the left has become, I think, very authoritarian in nature, and largely responsible for this ongoing culture war and a very suffocating atmosphere, which I think seeks to cancel or silence or marginalise anyone who kind of expresses an unfashionable political or moral opinion. And particularly if a person expresses that kind of opinion from any position of authority, if they've got any sort of public profile or any sort of influence, then they can expect to kind of be hounded and often driven out of their job. And I think what we've got in the country is what some people have called a soft totalitarianism. You know, we don't have secret police or we don't have a ban on newspapers, but I think there is increasingly that risk that your reputation or your career may be destroyed if you say the wrong thing. And the book argues that we need a serious pushback against some of this stuff. It's written from a very personal perspective. Austin talked about the references to Barking and Dagenham. That's the London borough towards the east of London where I grew up. And that area, particularly in the first decade of this century, went through some very profound changes as a result of globalization, really. And it was caught in a perfect storm of deindustrialization with the loss of thousands of blue-collar jobs from the local Ford factory and other industries. There was also very rapid demographic change in the community, which caused an enormous sense of bewilderment and disorientation among people. And people in that community looked to the Labour movement, its representatives, to assist them and to represent their views and to deal with their concerns. But were often patronised and told, actually, you know, you're racist or you're bigoted and this is the new world, you need to get on board, this is cosmopolitan liberalism and it's really, really good for you. So that really is the background to the book. It also goes into some detail about how I think the Labour movement needs to change and what it needs to do to change. And yeah, so it's a book about how the left has become very seriously disconnected from traditional working class voters, and it goes some way to explaining how to put that right.
Perfect.
I hope I didn't go over the 5 minutes I made.
No, perfect. Thank you very much indeed, Paul. So look, I mean, just leading on from where you finished there, the book is about the marginalization of the working class from political discussion as much as anything else, isn't it? And you kind of point about that there's this imposition of politics on people rather than maybe their participation in politics. And you saw that with the Brexit rebellion in some respects. But I was interested, following on from what you've just been saying about the definition of the working class or how you define it, and it's quite an impossible task, I realize that, but you say, if I can quote you, you say that in the good old days, this is a quote, not the good old days, that's my quote. Neighbors knew each other, they talked in the street and over the garden fence, that's one. But really you say working class people are patriotic, often socially conservative, communitarian, rooted, placing a high value on family, place, social solidarity and cultural stability. Okay, but you know, what I want to know is, are you kind of either oversimplifying or are you over romanticizing the working class, maybe to make your point?
I was always conscious when writing the book that there's always a danger that you do fall into the trap of romanticizing the working class, and I didn't want to do that. And I do kind of say in the book that we need to be honest about the vices as well as the virtues of the working class. I mean, there's no question that, you know, elements of the working class have over time embraced some of the worst aspects of cultural liberalism and economic liberalism, and we need to be blunt about that. But the reason I don't think it is over romanticized is because it's written very personally from somebody who lived in that type of community in Barking and Dagenham, grew up there, lived there for 35 years. It was really as working class a community as you could get, you know, very blue collar, never poor, but never affluent. The biggest council estate in the world at one point, the Becontree estate, which is where I grew up. And there really was that social solidarity, and that social solidarity was built around the common bonds that people shared, around the fact that there were these kind of universal values, and neighbours genuinely did spit. I mean, when I was growing up, I knew everybody on my street. When I moved away from the area a few years ago, I knew only the neighbours kind of next door to me, and there were clubs and there were institutions and churches and football clubs which really thrived and which were really built around that social solidarity. I remember, and again, I don't want to romanticize it, but I remember, and other people, not just Barking and Dagenham, these sorts of things I'm sure happen in other working class communities. When somebody died, you walk past their house, there would always be a post with a notice in the front garden, notifying neighbours that someone had died, thanking them for their cards and their flowers. And people would help out each other in times like that. But you just simply don't see that anymore. And I think that the impact of globalization in the first decade of this century cannot be underestimated. I quote figures in the book which shows just how profound it was in Barking and Dagenham, and how that acute combination of rapid economic change and rapid demographic change just violated people's sense of place. And an area that had been very stable and settled for decades was suddenly ripped apart in many respects. So yeah, you have to be careful not to romanticize it, but I don't think I've done that. I hope I haven't done that.
No, fair enough. I mean, I'm testing it out because, like I say, you confronted a lot of my opinions quite starkly through the book, so I'm just kind of testing some of my views out. But coming back to that, again, you say that we had a sense of belonging. We were parochial. Now, I've always understood parochial to mean having a limited, narrow outlook on life. But you say it, many, many times throughout the book as a positive concept. So again, I just wondered what you were angling at there.
That people had a real profound sense of belonging, and that people were proud of their town, their community. They experienced and felt those common bonds with people. When I was growing up in Barking and Dagenham, we knew, obviously, as I said, not just our neighbours, but people we went to school with. We knew their mums and dads. We belonged to local football clubs. We mixed with their parents. Our social network was wide and varied, and that wasn't because we were particularly popular, but that's just how it was. That's just what the community was in places like that. And I think there are a variety of reasons why that has changed. I've touched on globalization, and I think that was a huge factor. Of course, you need to factor in other things like advances in technology, for example, mean that humans just don't have that interaction. That face-to-face interaction as much as they used to. Kids now can just go to their bedrooms for the evening and be in contact with their friends over the computer game rather than going and grabbing a ball and playing football. So those things, of course, have to be taken into account as well. But I mean, I quote in the book, 40,000 people left the borough of Barking and Dagenham in that decade that I talked about between 2001 and 2011. I mean, there really was a mass exodus from Barking and Dagenham. And that was it was partly because some people had bought their council houses and cashed in on that and, decided to move away. But it was also largely, in my view, because people told me, because of the impacts of globalization, the very rapid and large-scale free movements of capital and labour, which can cause profound social and economic disruption in local communities. And it's a tough thing to have to say when you're on the left, by the way. To say to people in the trade union movement where I belong, look, this is how we got it wrong, and this is why we got it wrong. When it's an unpopular opinion, but you're either honest to yourself and you either say it as you see it, or you just peddle a line that isn't true. And I decided to say it as I saw it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, look, there's lots of questions I'm sure people can think about. That globalization, internationalization conversation in the book is a useful one, but I'll skirt that when I move on to the second chapter of your book, or third chapter on immigration and the pace of change, which you just mentioned. And since I'll feed you a question rather than give you a tough one, but since you've taken a lot of flack for it, I think it's worthwhile you trying to tease out that apparently contradictory view that you can be against multiculturalism but also be anti-racist. Do you want to just say how you square that circle?
Yeah, I think first of all, to be an anti-racist is pretty straightforward. You don't believe that anyone should be treated in an inferior fashion because of the colour of their skin, because of their race, because of their ethnic background. That should be anathema, I think, to anybody, whatever their politics, not just anybody on the left, but whatever their politics. I think multiculturalism is a different beast in many ways. And whilst I'm, profoundly supportive of the view that everybody should be free to worship the God they want to worship, to eat the food they want to eat, to wear the clothes that they want to wear, we absolutely defend people's individual freedoms to do that. I think we do need to have a look at how what I call state-sponsored multiculturalism has, whether we like it or not, led in many places to parallel communities. I'm a democratic socialist. I want to build the maximum commonality, the maximum unity between people. And I don't believe that we've done it particularly well. There are places in this country where people are living different lives and communities living completely different lives, sometimes within a stone's throw of each other. I don't think we've been very good at integrating people. I think there's a sense among particularly white working class communities, and I hate using the phrase white working class. I really do, but I only really use it when I think it's necessary. And white working class communities where they feel that actually their own culture is to be demonized, and they're not allowed to celebrate their own culture because people kind of sneer at that, or certainly the elites sneer at that. But at the same time, they're told that they have to celebrate and embrace other cultures. And Eric Kaufman, who I'm sure you're familiar with, Professor Eric Kaufman, has written about this, and it's something that he called asymmetrical multiculturalism. And I think he's right in that. So yes, I think the two things are different: being an anti-racist, but expressing concerns over state-sponsored multiculturalism.
Okay, we'll keep the academics out of this for a while. But since that's fine, right? But then there's a couple of points, like I say, and you've had a lot of flack for this because there is a jarring in the rhetoric. Maybe it sounds worse than it is. That's all I want to try and get through with you, or get you to get across, because you then go on to talk about borders, okay, and arguing for you argue against open borders. Only saying, so the Brexit dividend of the European Union free movement policy, that's one thing where actually closing borders was part of the deal. But you're against open borders in principle, and you want a limit on numbers. You say under 100,000 is the figure you're going to go for, and you say, if I can quote you, these caps must be rigidly enforced with no excuses for failure entertained. That's quite a harsh statement. And then you use the usual provisos about foreigners aren't taking our jobs. That's good. But I sense that you were saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, I sense you were saying that there were like maybe too many people for the resources available, which is a kind of an environmental argument, a Malthusian argument. So I just wondered, am I missing it? Am I getting you wrong, or can you just develop that point?
Yeah, I'll develop the point. I'm, as I say in the book, I'm pro-immigration. I think immigration has undoubtedly brought benefits to our country, to our society. But I think the whole issue, unfortunately, has become toxified. It's become poisoned, and it's become poisoned because I think that the legitimate concerns of working class people were just ignored and were not properly addressed. And I think that's really sad, because I think we were getting to a point in this country where immigration was becoming a bit of a non-issue. And that was a really good thing. I mean, we weren't suffering from some of the real problems we had in the 70s when the National Front were on the march, etc. But I think the policy of open borders, and I think particularly the impact of globalization and New Labour's embrace of pretty much an open door policy, where that began to impact very profoundly on communities like mine in Barking and Dagenham. People were told really to suck it up, that this will lead to improved GDP and you'll be 20 quid a month better off, as if that was all that matters, or this is going to give you cultural enrichment and you should embrace it. And actually people didn't really feel much better off for it in a kind of financial way, or in a cultural way, or in a spiritual way. And therefore I think the whole debate has become toxified. And what I find really interesting is that the position that I articulate in terms of regulation of the labour supply was until fairly recently quite mainstream on the left. I mean, it certainly wasn't controversial on the left until fairly recently. The open borders approach was very much a position limited to kind of Trotskyists and ultra liberals and anarchists. And many people on the left, including trade union figures, understood that regulation of the labour supply, the labour supply is a market dynamic, and like all market dynamics, it needs regulating so as to provide the best outcome for workers, so as to be able to, provide around jobs and housing, etc., welfare. And giving up that tool I think creates problems for any government. And I think also when you then factor in the impact that it can have, I mean, the truth is, as I say in the book, I think immigration in terms of the impact on wages has been broadly negligible. I think the evidence shows that. But when you drill down into particular sectors, it has certainly had an adverse impact in terms of downward pressure on wages in some sectors. And when you look at wage distribution as well, it's had an impact there with the lower wage people worse off and the middle or higher income people better off. And I think we need to separate the whole issue of race from immigration in many ways. We talk about immigration, we should, as a market dynamic, something that we need to control properly, because we don't want it to have disadvantages economically for already hard-pressed working class people. And B, we don't want it to lead to the kind of social problems that occurred in the community where I lived in Barking and Dagenham. Had we managed it better, those sorts of issues would never have happened. But because we effectively said, let's embrace open borders and to hell with anyone who opposes it, they must be racist, I think that's made the whole debate a poisonous one, and that's very sad.
Sure. And part of that management strategy, you go on to talk about how refugees, quotes, should be dispersed as widely as possible throughout the country, the better to promote assimilation and cohesion. And like I say, that's why it's an uncomfortable read, because when you read it, it sounds harsh, but when you think about it, maybe it's got some logic to it. But I just wondered, it might be a bit unfair of me because it only came out today, but Priti Patel today was talking about sending asylum seekers thousands of miles away to Gibraltar to be processed. And I don't know if you saw, Denmark is planning on capping the number of non-Western residents in their cities by 30%. So they have to be kind of sent elsewhere. Are you worried that, let's say your benign intent may be taken advantage of by less scrupulous actors?
I think that's always possible, but I think you just need to defend your corner, and I think you need to argue for what you believe is right. And I don't see it as an unreasonable proposition to say, look, if we have coming into the country 200,000 people a year, a net increase in the population, 250,000, 300,000 people, then you do have to have a fair and equitable system of making sure that each area has to take its fair share. And I think what we've not been very good at is doing that. And what we've seen instead is a situation where large numbers of people, like in Barking and Dagenham, might go to Barking and Dagenham, and the impact that can have, first of all, on local services. And I talk about some of the strains on local services in Barking and Dagenham and some of the problems that caused in the book. And also, the very profound social and economic disruption that can happen. I don't think it's unreasonable to say, actually, it shouldn't just be down to the likes of Barking and Dagenham to deal with this. It should be, down to the likes of Henley-on-Thames and Guildford and Harrogate and other places to deal with it too. And I believe profoundly, by the way, that migrants coming into the country should absolutely have the same rights as everybody else if they've arrived here by the legally, and if they've played it by the book, then I absolutely believe that they should be allowed to work. We should get them into trade unions. We should defend them from any sort of prejudice or racism.
Not citizenship rights, though. You make a point, yeah.
Well, I think, in terms of citizenship rights, I think there's a process to go through for everybody, and I think that everybody should be entitled to go through that process. But I absolutely believe in defending all migrants from any discrimination or prejudice. And as I say, if the system was managed properly, and if we had a situation where each area was expected to take its fair share of immigrants, I don't think the debate would become as poisoned as it has done.
Okay, very good. I got three more questions, if that's all right. One is on wokery, wokedom, whatever it's called. And you say it's barely an exaggeration to say that free speech is slowly dying in Britain. That's easy for you to say. But the SNP's hate crime bill just come out, where they're preparing to prosecute people for stirring up hatred in the privacy of your own home. You talk about non-crime hate crimes. How do you explain this kind of decline? Because we just voted to leave the European Union to take back control, whatever the phrase might be, and it seems that every semblance of control is being lost every day. Freedom, free speech, freedom of movement, and what have you. So how do you explain what's actually going on at the moment?
I mean, I don't necessarily see a direct link to the kind of whole EU question and you know, the hate legislation, which is becoming ever more deepening its roots into our society, and the general culture of wokeness, whereby, you know, people are expected to express a fashionable political or moral opinion if they're in any sort of position of authority, or if they have any sort of profile. And if they don't do that, if they express an alternative opinion, then they're cancelled or they're silenced. And I think the whole thing is disturbing. As I said at the outset, you know, we don't have the secret police, and we don't have bans on newspapers, etc. But sometimes you don't necessarily need those things, because if people know that their reputation, their livelihood, their career could be at risk for saying the wrong thing, then, you know, you don't necessarily need rigid legislation in place to prevent them. You just create that culture, which I think we've gone some way to doing. I mean, the legislation is certainly there, and I'll list some of the acts of parliament in the book, and I talk about how, you know, some of that has been interpreted, I think, in the most chilling way in many respects, and the incidents where people have found themselves on the wrong side of the law for no legitimate reason at all, and how things are now recorded as hate incidents, even though they're not necessarily crimes. So there is that increasing atmosphere of you know, oppression in many respects, where, you know, people are expected to follow a particular line, and if they don't follow that line, then, you know, their job or their livelihood is at stake. And I think actually, if you look at the stories that have come out over the last couple of years, you can see day after day example of where this sort of stuff is happening. I wrote about one a couple of weeks ago, some manager in NHS Wales who said on his social media account, and it was certainly clumsy, of course, but he said that, you know, people who don't speak the Welsh tongue in Wales are treated like people in apartheid South Africa. It's a stupid thing to say, but he was moved from his job. The NHS are investigating him. They condemned the remarks, and that's the sort of thing that we see. And this kind of grip that you know, this culture is having on people, I think, is disturbing, and I think we need a pushback against it.
Good. Pushback normally might come from trade unions, as you know more than most, and you say that the TUC are preoccupied with promoting identity politics these days. And then you go on to say, again, my phrase, it's old hat, but you say it's old hat to argue that, quotes, we have more in common with each other than with the bosses. That's as though solidarity on the basis of class is all that matters. But no, I'm old enough to remember a very early document, which a trade union document, which talked about having a policy of open hostility towards employers. I'm not suggesting that maybe we go back to that. So I understand that there's a mediated link now, but at the same time, you know, isn't that what trade unions are meant to do? I'm finding in a trade union, I'm in UCU for my sins, that siding with employers on many identity politics issues is the modus operandi of choice for many trade unions, rather than backing their own members. So shouldn't trade unions get back to some of that old business in hand of opposing employers' attacks? Or, you know, or what do you mean? What do you mean by suggesting that actually there's a solidarity to be gained by sticking with employers and not having that hostility?
I think what I was saying in that, I think that was in the chapter about immigration, where often one of the arguments from activists on the left is that we've got more solidarity with each other than we had with the bosses, and as if that's all that matters, that class solidarity, and therefore, you know, the rest of the working class should be completely in favour of an open borders policy, because it's kind of us and them, as if it's all about your place in the economic structure. And what I try to say in the book actually is about more than that. You know, it's not just, you can't just say that, well, because we're in the same place in the economic pecking order, therefore that is all that matters. And, you know, you should ignore all of the other kind of forms of social solidarity and cultural solidarity that might exist between other people. You know, as I say in the book, a worker might have more in common, or might feel he or she has more in common with his boss because, I don't know, they support the same football team, or they share the same religion, or they drink in the same pub, or they live in the same part of town. So they'll have to kind of navigate all of these things, and there are a whole myriad of things that have got the potential to create bonds between people and to divide people. And simply boiling it all down to class is important, of course it is, I make that point constantly, but boiling everything down to class simply doesn't resolve the issue in my view. On your point about trade unions, Austin, I couldn't agree more. I think the trade unions, I think, have got a lot to answer for. I think if you look at the strength of trade unions now, the influence of trade unions in the workplace now, it's waned alarmingly over the years. It's only half the number of members in trade unions now compared to 1980. 6.5 million now, it was 13 million in 1980. Part of that, of course, is down to deindustrialization, and we don't have the kind of industries, the unionized industries that we used to have. But partly, I think it's because of trade unions themselves. I see trade unions very much now, or the leadership of trade unions, I should say, as a kind of mouthpiece of the London liberal class, where it's itself obsessed with identity politics and has kind of retreated to its public sector comfort zone, as I say, and doesn't really have a strategy for reaching out to the private sector, where it's still needed desperately, where you've got people in the gig economy, you've got people on crap wages working in warehouses, you've people driving around delivering things on motorbikes and not having proper protections at work. People in transient and precarious employment. Those people need the trade union movement now as much as they ever did. But the trade unions are just not there. And I think that's a real problem for us.
Sure. Well, I mean, talking about rebuilding a new alternative, the final part of your book is, in some ways, a clarion call for the Labour Party to reinvent itself. I mean, it's a thread which runs through the book in some respects. Have I frozen? No, I'm still here.
No, you're still there.
So you say, let me just give you a call. You say the Labour Party is full of middle-class, Guardian-reading bohemians and pseudo-intellectuals pursuing an uber-liberal, youth-obsessed, London-centric agenda. In some ways, what you just described about the trade unions as it happened. So my final question, my big finale question is, what the hell are you still doing in the Labour Party? I mean, especially after all, they advocated voting Remain, just to bring us back to Brexit. So in full glare of publicity, you knew what you were voting for. So why are you still in there?
It's a question that often comes up. I mean, the reality is, I think that first of all, I think as things stand, there are still really only two parties that have got any chance really of forming a UK-wide government, the Labour Party and the Tories. For me, unquestionably, the Labour Party is the better of those two choices. I've been in the Labour Party for 26 years. I believe it's still to be the best vehicle by which we can achieve advances for ordinary working class people. I think there is an awful lot wrong with it at the moment, but I don't quite write it off. And I think if you look at the history of other parties trying to break through in our system, it's not been a particularly illustrious one. And for as long as the trade union movement, as much as I'm critical of the trade union leadership, but for as long as the movement itself, the official voice of workers, is part of the Labour Party, and for as long as other working class people are part of it, then I think I'll be part of it. And there are, for all its faults, there are people in it who I think are trying to take it in the right direction. I'm a part of Blue Labour. There are people within Blue Labour that work hard in the Labour Party to try and move it in the right direction and to try to articulate a more communitarian, post-liberal outlook and vision for the future. Groups like the English Labour Network, groups like Labour Future, who understand, the key thing is to reconnect with our traditional working class base. And I just don't think there's any other organisations around that, stand a chance of achieving that. So it's a question that comes up, and I understand why people ask it, but I still just about think it's the best vehicle to advance the interests of the working class. Okay.
I was just imagining how Keir Hardie would have thought when people said, why are you still in the Gladstone's Liberal Party? And he would have said, because there's no other alternative, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, all right. Look, thank you very much indeed, Paul. I've got 1,000,001 other questions. And if this had been a chat down the pub, I would have not let you off so lightly and we would have carried on for a bit longer. But we have to come out to the audience with their comments and questions. So I have a show of hands. Like I say, to everybody who doesn't know the system of Zoom, click on participants button, which is somewhere down the bottom on my version, and you'll get a little opportunity to press raise hand. So a number of people. We have Paul R. I have to read you out as they come. Paul R, please.
Hello. I haven't read the book, Paul, but sounds like it's definitely worth reading. You've actually partially answered my question almost with your last paragraph of your last answer. Because whenever I think of the Labour Party, maybe this is because I kind of become politically aware, I guess, in the early 80s, the names like Anthony Crosland would always come up, harking back to someone who in the Labour Party was theoretical and intellectual, etc., etc. So just three very brief points. Firstly, did people like that actually ever influence the Labour Party in any significant way, especially as far as pushing forward working class interests? The bit you've answered was my second bit, was if the Labour Party had people like that today, would it make a difference? You mentioned Blue Labour, etc. And the third part of it is, was actually people like Anthony Crosland, maybe Roy Jenkins, were they actually partly the beginning of the cause of the problems you actually see today?
Oh, blimey. Okay, encyclopedias out, everybody. Right, thank you very much, Paul, for really breaking the party spirit. We've got Syra, then Richard, then John Holbrook.
I think, Paul, with the question around immigration and class, you know, working class sort of traditions and language and customs, which people have, you know, found a lot of meaning, have always been in flux. And whilst people struggle to maintain their freedom and juggle that with public and private sort of demands, I couldn't quite square your comments around Dagenham. I know the Eastern Europeans came in numbers, and we know why that was in terms of the EU sort of free movement. But most people adapted and have adapted to that. The old question of resources and demands on housing and employment were there before, and that will continue to really happen. And Paul, I'm not sure that the problem is mainly to do with working class citizens. I think that could be what it is, that they choose not to be organised and defend and extend their material conditions and cultural expression. And they don't seem to be politically interested now. You know, currently there's a class that I would argue is very conservative, politically inactive and quite exhausted. And it's a difficult thing for somebody like me because I can't see the solution being in the Labour Party or the trade unions. And I've followed those movements and I'm part of the left. And I think we're in quite a difficult position right now where we have a peculiar thing where we have COVID and the working class of Great Britain tolerate quite a lot of cultural and restrictions, and its political and national life has changed quite a lot within this year. And it doesn't bode well that people comply so much with authority and the elites.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Just to remind you, Paul, we're taking a few. If I take maybe 4 or 5, the gist is that people can make their comments. If people are making similar comments, you can lump them back together when you want to answer them. If there's anything you don't want to answer, feel free to just walk all over them, and it will get through more contributions that way. Okay, we have Richard Bradford, please.
Yes, thank you. Paul, very interesting, your experiences in Dagenham. Very much relate to what I saw in East Lancashire in the 60s with the rundown of the cotton industry, the weaving, as it primarily was in that area. And in my own working life, I mean, I'm speaking to you from Sheffield, although I don't remember the steel industry. Steel is obviously a big issue in Sheffield, and the mines, of course. London itself was had a very diverse economy at one time. Lots of manufacturing used to be in London itself, not just in places like Dagenham. But you mentioned about the working class having social solidarity, sense of belonging. A lot of this has disappeared, you said, through the impact of globalization. So if you look not just in this country, but around the world, do you see if there's anywhere nowadays, any other society, any other country, which still has this sense of social solidarity, sense of belonging? And I was going to say, and Austin might laugh at this, what about China? I mean, China's supposed to be the manufacturing base of the world these days, or perhaps India. So perhaps you'd like to say something about that. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you very much. Paul, I'll take these next two and then I'll come back to you. So gird your loins. We have John Holbrook.
Paul, I think you clearly understand working class people, and you're exceedingly good at articulating their concerns. You are actually exactly the sort of person who ought to be a leader for working class people. But I actually think in one respect, and it's a very important respect, you are miles behind them. They have seen all the faults in the Labour Party and the trade union movement and the left more generally, and they hate it. They've disengaged from it, and they are looking for an alternative. And by you saying you are a democratic socialist and you hope that the Labour Party is going to transform itself, it's just pie in the sky. And it's really, what you're trying to do is bang a square peg in a round hole. That they are ahead of you, and you really need to start listening to what they are saying on this particular issue. And it's not good enough to say, look, I've been in the Labour Party for 26 years, so I'm going to stay there for another 26 years. Why can you not learn from that 26 years of experience? Why can you also not see that all of the arguments that you've mounted here in terms of faith, family, flag, all of the policy prescriptions you put forward are not those of the left. They are actually those of the centre right. If you look at someone like Roger Scruton, all of his arguments are on a par with your arguments. So why can you not free yourself from your background and the left and do what is so urgently needed in this country, which is to start building a centre-right alternative that actually embraces proper social conservatism?
There you go. That started so well for you, Paul. And but I think it's good. It's nice to have a bit of robust criticism and in these contributions. So I'll just take Daniel Ben-Ami, then I'll come back to Paul, then I'll come back out to John Bryan. So Daniel, if you are there, you are muted. Daniel,
So
you're kind of underwater, Daniel, at the moment.
I'm not sure why.
Oh my God. Right. You're lurking in the dark there. Okay, we can see you, Daniel.
Okay, I'm not sure what's happening with the tech. But anyway, yeah, a couple of questions. One, in a way, follows up on from what John has just said, but maybe in a more gentle way. Just, is there any point that Paul could identify where he would say, okay, I've had enough with the Labour Party, that's it? I mean, can he identify anything in advance where he would say, okay, well, I have to break from it now? And secondly, I wasn't clear from what he said what he thought was specific about the early 2000s, the first decade of that decade. It may be in his book. I'm afraid I've not read the book yet, but I'm sure working class people did suffer as a result of restructuring in the early 2000s, and there may well have been things happening in Dagenham in particular, but you could argue that a kind of constant restructuring is a normal part of working class life. And even things like globalization, like the free movement of capital and labor, wasn't unique to the early 2000s. So what is particular about that decade that he thinks is so important?
Thank you very much indeed, Daniel. Okay, Paul, if you want to come back on some of those points.
I'll pick up on them as best I can. So in terms of the first question, the references to Tony Crosland, Roy Jenkins, etc. What I argue in the book is that the Labour Party at its best has always been that coalition, as I called it, between Hartlepool and Hampstead. So, it's traditional blue-collar working class base being Hartlepool, but also attracting a layer of more middle-class, more affluent professional individuals who share Labour's vision for a fairer society. And it's been most electorally successful when it's been able to hold that coalition together. My argument is that coalition has become seriously unbalanced and that Hartlepool has been elbowed out and now it's pretty much all Hampstead. I absolutely believe there is a place for the Hampsteads in the party, and it's better for their existence in the party, but the pendulum needs to swing back quite decisively. And unless it does that, then I don't believe that the Labour Party has got a chance of winning another general election. I mean, I agree with much of what Sarah said. I mean, in terms of the working class, she made the point about the importance of organising. I think that's absolutely right. I wouldn't necessarily say they are apathetic about politics. I think they often feel that politicians are apathetic about them, and that can kind of lead to a demoralisation sometimes, which can be interpreted as apathy. But I think when you get speaking to people about their stresses and about their concerns, then often they come alive and they tell you about what their demands are and how they think that politicians are letting them down and how they don't understand working class communities, etc. Richard's point, I wouldn't trumpet China in any way, shape or form. But to answer the question, I do touch on in the book Japan. And I think Japan, I mean, I should say I've never been to Japan, so I don't speak about it from the inside, as it were. But it does strike me that Japan is the kind of society, far from perfect, no society is perfect, but that does, on the one hand, understand the importance of a common culture, understand why it's important to respect some people's innate social conservatism, understand the importance of building common bonds between people, understand people's innate patriotism, but at the same time, he's not in any way a virulently kind of nationalist or aggressive. I mean, he's had its problems in the past, we know that only too well, but at the moment, I think it's fair to say it's a modern, advanced, liberal democracy, and it doesn't have an open borders policy, controls immigration, but nonetheless treats foreigners well. And I don't think anyone would say that Japan is kind of backward or in any way kind of reactionary, because it follows that particular policy. And it's never been seduced by the argument, by the way, that in order to achieve economic success, then it has to have large-scale immigration. If you speak to people who know the country, they will say actually most people in Japan don't really want to see it become anything other than Japan, although they are, a tolerant and a decent country. In terms of John's point, I guess we're not going to agree on it, John. I mean, undoubtedly there are people on the left who hate the working class. That's certainly true, and in very, many respects, that's the whole point of my book, to explain why that's the case. And you may be right, John. It may be that the Labour Party can never win back the support of the working class, and it's dead as an electoral force, and somebody or something else may break through. I just say I don't see that particularly on the horizon at the moment in any serious way. And pendulums do sometimes swing back the other way. I mean, the Labour Party itself has undergone, pretty significant change backwards and forwards in its time. I mean, when Corbyn took over in 2015, few people could have predicted a year or two before that the change that was going to take place in the Labour Party then. So I don't rule out, accepting much of what you say, I don't rule out, the possibility that the Labour Party can be won again, and can be won to a programme that is espoused by the likes of Blue Labour within the Labour Party and the English Labour Network, etc. But I don't underestimate the job that's there to do. Daniel's question, I think in terms of why I sort of identify the first decade of this century in terms of the impacts on working class communities, for me, that was the decade, I think, where the effects of globalization were at their most acute and began to be felt most profoundly in many working class communities. I speak personally, I was born in Barking and Dagenham in 1974. The area was pretty much unchanging for the first 25 years, but as I've identified in that first decade, we started to see very rapid and large-scale movements of capital and labour, and the effects in terms of deindustrialisation and rapid demographic change. And I think that was common actually in many working class communities around that time. And I don't think, there was the EU enlargement thing, of course, in 2004, which I think very much played into that. And I think it was no coincidence that was actually the decade where Labour started to hemorrhage quite a lot of working class votes. Labour hasn't won the popular vote in England, for example, since 2001. And I think what we saw in that first decade is millions of working class people who tribally were Labour suddenly felt that actually their lives were being impacted in a very profound way, and that the Labour Party were really doing nothing about it, or worse, were telling them to actually embrace it. And because of that, I think we saw large numbers of working class people either abstain or flock to UKIP at that time, or flock to, in some cases, the BNP. In Barking and Dagenham, 12 BNP councillors were elected, their best ever performance in local government. And I think all of that can be traced back to you know, the acute effects of globalization. And one thing I try and argue with people as well is often people on the left will say to me, well, it's all down to austerity, as long as we invest more, and as long as we end austerity, you'll find that some of these problems will simply disappear. Actually, you know, if you look at what really happened in working class communities, some of these concerns and some of this disruption and some of this kickback was coming before the global financial crash in 2008. In Barking and Dagenham, the 12 BNP councillors were elected in 2006. You know, this is after a period where we'd had consistent economic growth in this country for over a decade. So simply reducing it all the time to an economic argument doesn't cut the mustard as far as I'm concerned. You need to address people's concerns in terms of, you know, the social impacts of globalization, the cultural impacts of globalization, and you can't just dismiss them and tell them to suck it up. I think I covered everyone.
Yeah, you can ride roughshod over some of these if you want to, Paul. Don't feel as if you have to go through each one in turn. But we got John Bryan next.
Yeah, thanks, Austin, and thanks, Paul, for the introduction, and I very much enjoyed the book. Just to kind of pick up on some of the points that people have been saying around, you know, the Labour Party and trade unions and whether or not you should get involved with them. I think, I left the Labour Party in 1987. I don't ever intend to go back to it, I have to say. But I've been a trade unionist all my life, and that's something that I continue to be involved in. And I think that's something that, I think someone mentioned about a centre-right party. I mean, centre-right parties certainly don't seem to fight for, you know, the economic interests of the working class in the way that I think trade unions do. But, you know, I'm just thinking about if one of the things that you're trying to do is attract younger people towards a particular political position, how can you do that? Because obviously one of the things you talk about in your book is about the way in which the left, well, it's called despised, isn't it? How the left despise the working class. So how can you go, if that's your view, you know, of the left, it's very difficult to say, well, you know, that's their view, but let's go along and get involved in them, you know. So I mean, I can see how you can get involved in some kind of campaigns or organizations, you know. So you might have a campaign against austerity, or you might have a campaign for, you know, for Brexit or whatever it might be, you know, but actually kind of persuading people that they need to get involved in a trade union where the politics might be very different to people, or the Labour Party where actually that particular local Labour Party might be very hostile to, you know, either your views or their views. So, you know, I'm just wondering, how would you kind of, what if you had a young person who was kind of like wanted to kind of challenge some of these ideas, and, you know, what would you kind of say about what they would do? Because I would find it very difficult to say, right, well, join the Labour Party and get involved that way, whereas I could put an argument forward about either joining a trade union or about joining a trade union campaign or a progressive campaign around a particular issue. I just think it's but it is, you know, quite a difficult thing to do, I think. So thank you.
Thanks, John. I'm minded after that contribution, if you don't mind, everybody. Paul, do you want to come back and answer that one directly? Because I think we could then.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it touches obviously on some of the answers that I gave previously to John and yourself, Austin. But I think the first thing you say to people is, if you're on the left, be involved in something. You know, whether it's a political party, whether it's the trade union movement, be involved in something where you're going to try and affect change. I always remember Paul Foote, the old socialist worker journalist, who used to say that, you know, some people on the left who belong to what he called the National Association of Non-Aligned Socialists, otherwise known as the Nanas, who don't really, you know, impact anything in a positive way, but will just kind of, you know, moan from the sidelines in many respects. You need to be involved, and you need to fight your corner. I just make the calculation that as things stand at the moment, the best vehicle to do that is the Labour Party. I don't see any other organisation coming through and being the voice of workers in that way. And I know some people will say, well, it's a chicken and egg. Unless you try and create something, you're not going to achieve it. But I do, you know, let's not write off the Labour Party. There are still, for all its faults, you know, there are still good things about the Labour Party, and you know, even with the Blair government, I make the case in the book that as much as I profoundly disagreed with much of what Blair did, you know, I think compared to a Tory government, then there was much more of a focus on the poorer people in society, investment in schools and hospitals, etc. Which I think your point is right, John, which you wouldn't get under a Conservative government or a centre-right government. You know, it's important, I think, that people on the left are attached to something where there is a chance of fighting for more economic equality and against economic injustice. And the Labour Party, for me, will always do that more than the Tories. I've been pleasantly surprised actually, by the number of people who have read the book and are part of the Labour movement, if not members of the Labour Party, but you know, the trade union officials or activists have said to me, actually, you know, I agree with much of what you say. It strikes me that actually there's probably more people on the left that do agree, but perhaps, you know, don't have the confidence to say so because of the reaction that they would get in their own unions or in their constituency Labour parties, etc. So I think there's an audience there to develop, and it's like anything, you know, you win by organising and win by pressure. And you know, I try and do that for my part in the Labour Party. I do think the landscape has changed since December 2019, where, you know, people were in charge of the party and couldn't see the train crash that was coming. They thought, you know, we're a mass membership party, we're the biggest party in Europe. Jeremy Corbyn's playing to packed houses everywhere, onwards and upwards to victory. And I think actually those of us who were arguing, look, we are about to lose our red wall, have got a certain amount of political capital, and you know, we need to take that into the party and exploit it. So I know I'm not probably going to convince anybody that it's right to be part of the Labour Party, but it's
all right, Paul. You can work on that line. We'll get there at the end, maybe. So I preferred the Barking and Dagenham Tourist Board spiel, but we'll come back to the Labour Party recruitment drive maybe throughout the conversation. All right, I've got a ridiculous amount of hands up, which is always a good sign, but it does mean that we're going to have to take some not brief, but, you know, not ridiculous comments. And Paul, if you can just go for punchy responses as well. So I'll take 5 at a throw, if that's all right. So pen at the ready. I've got Joe Herlihy.
Hi, Paul, I'm very sympathetic to your attempts to address the fragmentation that you're experiencing in the working class. I've got a couple of issues though, and also a suggestion in terms of reposing some of the issues that you've raised in the book, which I thought was very interesting. I think there's a little bit of, it's not historical amnesia, but I don't think your book goes back far enough in terms of addressing some of the problems. So unfortunately, you've made me feel very old, because when you were born, living next to me in Essex was a family who supported the National Front quite openly, and same down the road. My father worked in Fords in Dagenham in the 80s, and you know, productivity was already declining in the 80s, wages already declining in the 80s, and I think that precedes what you're saying in terms of immigration. And unfortunately for me, the figurehead for me was actually incredibly racist. There was sectionalism rife within the trade union movement, within Fords in Dagenham, and the attitude towards immigrants was disgusting. And as a consequence, I couldn't bring myself to join the Labour Party. So that's unfortunate, more than unfortunate. And I suppose from that, it therefore suggests to me that there's something more deep-rooted in the history of the Labour movement that we need to get to grips with. I just think, even though I'm sympathetic, I think locating the problems when you do doesn't sufficiently address the fact that there are problems prior to the woke multiculturalism, all the rest of it. So my suggestions, I think, on 2 areas. One would be around, you raised the question of the family as a central thing around social conservatism. I would like to see that reposed. There's a discussion that looks at the question about the need to redefine and defend the separation between the public and the private. And I think that would be a very healthy debate that we could have, regardless of what party you come from, to re-establish that division and stop the intervention that's happening in family life. And the second one is, I would repose your question of patriotism. That doesn't sit well with me really at all, Irish background, but again, there you go. I would rather see the question posed around democracy, and that for me, about the need for the working class to defend vigorously democracy would be a much more satisfactory position to be arguing than one around patriotism.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you very much. We have Rush Harrier.
Hi, Paul. I'm a big fan of your work and I'm looking forward to reading the book. Two quick questions. Firstly, it might be argued that the Labour Party already well represents many millennials and Gen Zers who, although they may be middle class and uni educated in their family backgrounds, they have low income jobs, work on 0-hour contracts sometimes, saddled with student debt, no property, but they are socially liberal, pro-EU, and actually support a lot of the fringe causes that the Labour Party seems to be in favour of. If the Labour Party already has this new, quite reliable constituency, why does it need to accommodate the traditional working class who often hold the opposite viewpoints on these issues? Secondly, it's just been announced tonight that by Labourists that the Labour Party has picked a Southern Remainer who lost his seat in 2019 as a candidate for the Hartlepool by-election from a short list of one. Firstly, what are they playing at? And secondly, has Hartlepool been lost forever in favour of Hampstead?
Hartlepool was a target seat for Brexit Party, wasn't it? Okay, Phil Hammond, please.
Paul, I haven't finished the book yet, so forgive me if this is unfair, but it strikes me so far that you are underestimating the problems that you describe for two reasons. One is when you're talking about the values of traditional working class communities, it comes across to me as a little bit like you're talking about an older generation. And I wonder if there's a kind of generational divide there. That's to say that younger people don't necessarily have the same set of values, partly because the conditions that produce those values don't exist anymore, and partly because the expansion of university education. And that's one reason. The other reason is that when I was reading that you remark a few times in the book on Jeremy Corbyn, it strikes me that Corbyn and also Bernie Sanders in the US, they were kind of throwbacks to the kind of traditional socialist politics that you seem to want to revive. Well, in both cases, they were unsuccessful. You could argue, well, they both got kind of sucked into contemporary woke identity politics, but they were also, I think, a kind of limited appeal in and of themselves. It's like you can't fall to something new by just going back 30, 40 years and trying to revive the past.
Thanks very much, Phil. So we have Jay Hussey.
Hi there. I grew up in London too. I grew up in South London though. And the thing that I found was my mum's Irish, and where I grew up was very mixed and almost multicultural before multiculturalism existed. So you had a very West Indian community living alongside a very Irish community. And our area became gentrified as I was growing up. And basically most working class people moved out to places that they could afford. And where I grew up in Lavender Hill and Clapham Junction, it became a very middle class liberal area. And it just got me thinking, because growing up, I went to school in Elephant and Castle, and I was actually really shocked at the racism of the people that I went to school with, because in South London, we didn't seem to have that tension that existed in maybe Southeast London and East London. And I was shocked by the racism in East London as well. It just struck me. I find it really interesting, this whole thing about community, because we were a community in the same sense. We had the same things that you talked about, the clubs, the institutions, all the sorts of things. But we were broken apart really by gentrification. It felt like we were broken apart by gentrification more than a kind of breakdown of industry or anything like that. For me, growing up in London in the kind of 70s and 80s, we were very resentful of the Labour Party as working class people. We felt that even then they didn't represent our interests. And actually, somebody in the chat was talking earlier about Norman Tebbit talking about getting on your bike. And I have to admit, you know, as somebody who's now kind of gone through Marxism and all sorts of other things, you know, that I did vote Tory when I was very, very young, because I thought, yes, you know, actually, I can achieve something. I can get out of this hellhole that I'm in, and I can make something for myself. And Thatcherism was very attractive, precisely because working class people didn't feel that the Labour Party did represent us. And you talked about that very much at the very, very beginning. Okay. And sorry, the only thing that I wanted to say is why is it that the Labour Party or Liberals cannot cope with engaging with what the working class really want?
Thanks. Sorry to hurry you there. Okay, we'll just take Hilary and Glyn, and then I'll come back to Paul. Hilary.
Yeah, not from London. I guess I wanted to kind of mount a kind of bit of a defence of the trade unions and kind of follows on some of the stuff in the chat as well as what Paul said. I paint this in heroic sweeps, and it's much more complicated than this, really. But I would say there are some of the very big general unions who have very heterogeneous members who don't have very much power in the workplace, and I think they have been kind of captured by the woke agenda and the green agenda as well, which we haven't talked about at all. But there are also some specific kind of profession-based unions who I think are actually doing some really good work, not just defending members' terms and conditions, but also defending professional standards. And I think that's a really important part of trade unionism that really is kind of worth defending. And I think those people are, those kind of unions are probably less likely to be affiliated to the Labour Party, less likely to be stuffed with those kind of victim-obsessed people. And I think it's a bit of a mistake to just talk all the time about, you know, we need to unionise these, you know, 0 hours contract workers. And not that I disagree with that, but, you know, train drivers need a union too, and better paid people need a union to defend their terms and conditions too. And nobody should be kind of scared of that. So I just wanted to make a bit of a plea for a bit more painting the greys rather than trying to make things quite so black and white.
Very good, thank you. Glyn.
Hi there. Yes, thank you. Apologies, Paul, I haven't read the book yet. I've just literally ordered it tonight. One of the things I am slightly confused about who your target is, and this maybe you go into depth in the book about this, because it sounds like a lot of it is anti-left, but all the problems that I can see that you're talking about were caused by the right, by neoliberalism, by Thatcher, by Blair. You know, the mass immigration of the 2000s was utterly down to neoliberalism and Blair. The smashing industrial areas was down to Thatcher in the 1980s and 1990s. The left are powerless. They're impotent. I mean, they might be embarrassing, but they've done nothing to actually create these problems. Yes, you know, I've come out of the left. I still regard myself in the left, and I find it infuriating that they fail to understand what immigration is and how it affects a lot of working class people, for example. And you're quite right, the same about multiculturalism, which lots of people on the left have also written about, whether the IWCA or Kenan Malik. You know, it's not something you've kind of discovered here. But what I would like to ask you more is, what is your strategy? You mentioned two groups you're in. You know, I was involved in the IWCA back in the 1990s, and their slogan was working class power in working class areas. How do you propose to rebuild, I don't know what you want to call it, class consciousness, class, the working class clubs? What is it, and how is it you plan to do that in the Labour Party or outside the Labour Party? I mean, do you mention community organising at all or anything like that? Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Glyn. All right, Paul, we're back to you. Obviously, there's a couple of overly supportive statements, so you haven't got to treat them as questions. A nice harsh one at the end from Glyn, saying that you've missed the point. You've missed the entire point. It's the right, not the left, that are a problem. So anyway, come back and give it your best shot.
Okay, I'm obviously not going to. I'll try and cover what I can from each individual, but I probably won't be able to cover every point from every individual. In terms of taking them in order, in terms of Joe's point, I think there's certainly merit in the argument that some of this was set in train before the turn of the century, and you talked about Fords in the 1980s. Definitely, I mean, you look at the miners' strike in the 1980s, you look at some of the attacks on workers in the 1980s, and some of the stuff that Thatcher pushed through. There's no question, and arguably, when you look at Thatcher in terms of the Single European Act and support at the time for the single market, some of the seeds here were very much sown before the period that I pinpoint in the book. I just feel that that particular decade, the first decade, was where that impact was at its most acute. And I think you look at the hemorrhage of support away from the left, from the working class, I think it probably supports that. Democracy and patriotism, I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I'm absolutely in favour of the working class organising for more democracy. I think patriotism and belief in the nation state is very much part of that. For me, the nation state is the best form of democratic government at its upper limit. I think when you go beyond that, the elasticity of democracy begins to stretch and break. I think any attempt really at kind of supranationalism, such as the EU, doesn't really have the consensus of many working class people. So I do see the two in terms of democracy and patriotism being intertwined really, and certainly not incompatible. Rush's question about younger people are the new constituency really for the Labour Party. Why would the Labour Party accommodate the more traditional working class these days? I think really because it can't win without them. I don't think it can win actually without the Hampstead vote. As I said earlier, it's most successful electorally when it's been able to hold Hartlepool and Hampstead together, and it's not really able to get over the line without either part of that equation. I think the problem is that, as I said, the pendulum has swung too far one way, and there are people within the party, including some MPs, who have made the point to me that we just need to rely on that younger, more liberal, more Remain supporting constituency, perhaps build a coalition, with the Greens or the Lib Dems. And for me, that would be an abandonment of all that the Labour Party was about. It was created to be the voice of ordinary working class people in what are now post-industrial communities. And if it walks away from that and says, well, we don't need you anymore, then I think it would have jettisoned everything that it stood for. Phil's point, I think, where he said that underestimating the problems and young people don't necessarily have the same values. I mean, in many respects, I write in the book that there's the emergence of what some people have called the new working class, which is, of course, younger and more cosmopolitan in outlook, less politically tribal, more likely to be in favour of the globalisation agenda and so on, open borders. Nonetheless, those people still do often suffer the same problems, especially if they're younger and they're trying to get a foot on the housing ladder. They're suffering from low wages, etc., precarious employment. And I think it's often the case, I think we probably all know this from experience, that as people do become older and suddenly you've got a family and a mortgage, you do sometimes develop that more communitarian, more, dare I say, parochial outlook on life, and can be won over by some of the arguments that I'm making. I certainly don't believe, as I'm at pains to stress in the book, that because those people don't share the views these views, that somehow they can't be regarded as part of the working class. Of course they are, and of course we need to build the maximum unity among the class. I guess my argument is that constituency has had people in authority, in power, political parties speaking for them, and almost exclusively then in some respects. They've got the Labour Party, they've got the Lib Dems, they've got the Greens. It's the other part of that coalition, the more traditional working class, the more small c working class that have been neglected and ignored, and those are the people we need to touch base with. The point about Jay, I think the name was the multiculturalism in South London, and how actually it was the gentrification of the area that caused problems in the area. I mean, I get a lot of that, and of course, I mean, there are examples. I mean, post-war, For example, the immigration from the Commonwealth and many of the boroughs in East London underwent change much before Barking and Dagenham did. If you look at places like Tower Hamlets and Hackney, etc. I guess the point about more recent years, and particularly the point about Barking and Dagenham, and I think the figures bear this out, is it was simply the pace and the scale of the change that was so bewildering and disorientating for people. The very profound and very quick change. They felt a sense of violation. It wasn't a sense of race that had been violated. It was a sense of order that had been violated. And when people did leave in their thousands and went to places like the Essex coast or Kent, a lot of people called that white flight. And I really don't think it was. I think it was, as I say in the book, I think it was a flight to familiarity rather than a white flight on the basis of the fact that they didn't particularly want to live with people who had a different colour skin. I do think we made a mistake when we went for the salad bowl over the melting pot. That's an argument that I make in the book, that actually I think we would have been much better in terms of integration and assimilation if we'd gone for the melting pot strategy rather than the strategy that actually almost encourages separation and separateness and difference and division between people. That, of course, is very much a long-running debate. Hilary, I think I agree with everything you said, Hilary. I'm a proud trade unionist. I've been a trade unionist since I was stacking shelves in Asda when I was 16. I joined the GMB union. My dad was a shop steward in the Transport and General Workers Union. My mum worked for the GMB actually as a secretary. And without doubt, I've stood on picket lines many, many times. Without doubt, trade unions are a force for good in the workplace. And if you compare workplaces that are unionised in terms of wages and protections, health and safety, conditions of service, invariably they are better for workers than places that are not. And you'll never get me saying that the trade unions are not a force for good. I think history tells us that. I'm not saying you were saying that, Hilary, but I think history tells us that they are a force for good. I guess sometimes self-criticism is important for any movement, and I don't think trade unions have been reflective enough about why they are less and less of a force in industry than they used to be. Simply putting it down to deindustrialization is not good enough for me. I think a lot of it's self-inflicted. In terms of Glyn's point, I guess that comes back to the argument about whether Blair was on the left or whether Blair was on the right. I don't think it was just Blair. I think there was a large element of the left, particularly the liberal left, that did embrace the new global market, that did embrace open borders and globalization and all that came with it. And yes, of course the right are responsible for the worst aspects of neoliberalism, etc. I wouldn't challenge that, but I don't think we can exonerate the left. There was a large element of the left that looked to celebrate that new globalization and champion it in many respects, and that in many respects is my target. The liberal left, plus I think elements of the far left who I think are responsible for taking the movement away from working class people. I do, in terms of the strategy, I wouldn't disagree with what Glenn said. You need to speak face to face with people. You need to organise in the community. One thing I say about Momentum, for all my criticism of them, they organised bloody well across the movement when they wanted to make their case and when they wanted to make their influence felt in the Labour movement. I didn't agree with the vast majority of what they argued for. But it showed how you can organise at a grassroots level and cut across normal methods of organising and have an impact in a movement that until then had seemed a little bit sterile and like it was kind of impervious to change. So I don't disagree necessarily with much of that. I think that was everyone, Austin.
Okay, yes. You didn't get the memo, did you, Paul? So try not to go through everybody's point. We'll be here till midnight. Right, now, I'm getting a bad reputation because I'm going to blame Paul of my chairing. So I've got 10 hands remaining. I'm going to take all 10 in one flurry. So that means two things. One, you're going to have to be kind of reasonably concise in your questions and comments and fewer reminiscences. And Paul, you cannot answer every single one of them. So just try and get the theme of what they're getting at. Yeah. Especially if they're agreeing with you. Don't wallow in their love. Go for the hard ones. Okay. We've got Martin Jackson first, please.
Oh, hi, Paul. Yeah, very impressed by the book. I think when I first came across you was actually on Politics Live, and you were on there with Lloyd Russell Moyle, and it really struck me sort of how disparate the views were between yourself and himself. The question I have is, what existing parliamentary Labour MPs are that you identify with, that you actually can feel can lead the party back closer to power, pursuing the sorts of agenda you are espousing in your book?
Martin, you get the award for the night. Thank you very much indeed for that. Short and sharp, to the point. We have Julia, please.
Hi, Paul, thank you. I read your book. It was very interesting. I have to say, though, that I am part of the, the liberal left. I don't really know anyone who's voted for Brexit. I'm in my 20s. I went to university in London and so on and so forth. I am part of that group of people on the left who you say loathe the working class, and I would argue vice versa as well. And my issue is that I don't think Labour can win an election without the working class, just the same as Labour can't win an election without this new liberal left side of the party. And how do we reconcile the differences that exist between these two wings? And how can we find something that kind of unites us instead of bickering between each other? Because I don't feel like this way we'll ever see a Labour government the way we keep going on. Thank you.
Julia, thank you very much indeed. Very useful. Ian Lewis.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Austin. Along the same lines, really, but from a different perspective, I campaign for Brexit. I consider myself to be working class, and I'm interested in what you think the immediate prospects are for the Labour Party. If we look at the likes of Scotland and the red wall seats going, and the decline in the working class vote and support for the Labour Party, where does it go after this, really? How does it get back to power? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ian. Nico, please.
I've not read your book because Austin said you had to sell it to us, Paul, but I have heard you talk about it many times, and I'm sure I'll be ponying up to Amazon or some other globalist corporation for it. I wondered, what is it about the modern left that hates the working class, which obviously the sentiment of your book, and I wonder how you see the Labour Party having been reconstituted, because it seems to me it's partly been reconstituted around kind of middle class people, not unlike me actually, including the militant cosmopolitan globalists who you charmingly describe them as, public sector workers and professionals, ethnic minorities, people on welfare, and the progressive young like Julia, who just spoke, I suspect. And it feels to me like the Labour Party today is much more like the Liberal Party or the Liberals of the 19th century, who didn't have a sense of solidarity with the working class and rather feared the mass, but gave them enough charity and reform that they didn't revolt, rather than being at their side and trying to help them live more fulfilled lives to realize their agency. So do you think is it the agency of working class people that the left hates, that it's a threat to have a group in society which has separate agency from themselves? Or is there something else about it? Because clearly the working class had more agency historically, and yet the left didn't hate the working class, it actually embraced it.
Very good, thank you. Theo.
Hi, yeah, I like a lot of what you said, Paul. And yeah, I guess to echo some of the other questions, it's interesting. I didn't know that Hartlepool had chosen Dr. Paul Williams as their candidate without any democracy at all, which is interesting, it appears. So I'm wondering if you think that the red wall shift is a permanent one. Will the pendulum swing back in those areas, or is it a bit like the what happened in the southern states of America with Democrats losing in all those areas, many years ago? I wonder if that's a shift that's happening just naturally.
Very interesting. Thank you. We have Andrew MacDonald Powney. Are you there, Andrew?
I was just going to try to contribute two things from Scotland, since it's only been mentioned in the it's only been mentioned in the context of the hate crimes bill, and there were two things that struck me as relevant here. One is that there has been an attempt to respond to migration with a slightly different policy, which is along the lines Paul seems to be talking about in the book that, like some others, I have not read yet. Because of the way migration went in Easter House, there's been an attempt to spread migration in exactly the way you're talking about. And the second thing I wanted to mention was the housing policy, which is different from down south. Because in both, if the contradiction between capital and labour is intrinsic, and the Blairites, for want of a better expression, were quite happy to welcome something that lowered the price of labour, but they didn't actually want the consequences that affected them. They wanted freedom of capital. It seems to me you can respond to that in two ways. You can either say, I want to restrict labour, but not capital, which doesn't work. Or you can actually go the whole hog. And in that case, you need a different focus. You can't resolve this intrinsic contradiction by being focused on numbers of migrants. So it's got to be a policy focus. And that's why I think it needs to go down to housing. And it might be worth having a little look at some of the detail of the Scottish housing position, because in various ways, it's trying to confront a problem coming from ecology anyway, where we're going to have to think about reallocating housing and using brownfield and looking at tax nudges and looking actually at property rights and a degree of compulsion and all sorts of things that are far too socialist for the Blairites.
Okay, those phrases like a degree of compulsion always kind of just jump out of the screen, don't they?
I know.
All right, thank you very much indeed. That was very useful. We have James and Hannah, or one or other.
Yeah, sorry, my daughter's not with me tonight, so it's just me. Thanks, Paul. I read your book. It arrived under my Christmas tree, and it was a really good read. I'll declare my hand here because I first saw you with your contribution to the Deplorables film, I think, and that's where you really caught my interest. I'm talking to you from Bavaria, where there's social conservatism. There is huge public investment in public amenities, and of course there's a lot of workers' councils as well. So don't be frightened of this sort of middle ground of politics, because I can tell you it does work. So my question really is, in the last general election, you criticised the sort of Corbyn cheerleaders for the just one more heave approach, or the if only I could explain it one more time, you'll understand. Aren't you the epitome of that, given your attachment to the Labour Party? That's my point.
Thank you very much indeed, mate. John, I'm sure there's many Johns, but hopefully you can see who you are.
It's me. I'll be very succinct. I was wondering about the role of the electoral system in generating the problems you identify, and would you favour a move towards some sort of proportional representation? And that's it.
Good man, John. Thank you very much. Neil Davenport.
Hi, just on Paul's faith in the Labour Party, which does seem to be, coming back to time and time again, and this has been mentioned, I think, by Ian. I wonder what you think about Labour's complete implosion in Scotland, and I think the rise of the SNP is actually interesting in that it's a party that has considerable working class support, in places like Glasgow, but peddling ultra woke politics. That often seeks to reform the Scottish working class. Now, by contrast, though, the English and Welsh working classes voted for Brexit, which hasn't really been enough discussion about Brexit tonight. Undoubtedly, I think an explosive sense of working class agency, and also why it was met with such hostility by the middle class left. In England as well, the working class decided to vote for the Tories as a way of honouring the Brexit mandate from 2016, but you still keep coming back to reclaiming the Labour Party as a progressive vehicle. But I think if you have a party that's going in the opposite direction of working class demands, centred around greater freedom and democracy, doesn't that indicate how difficult it is for the Labour Party to become an expression of current progressive working class demands around Brexit?
Thanks very much. Okay, Bernie, final comments, please.
It's Dennis.
Dennis.
Hiya. There's an Irish racehorse owner got himself in big trouble for sitting on a dead horse. You probably will all remember hearing about it in the last few weeks. But Paul is likely to get himself into deeper trouble for flogging a dead horse, I think. In my opinion, that great historical movement that became the British working class labour movement, by the turn of the century, by 1915, if you listen to what Winston Churchill had to say, who was no lover of working class people, he said the trouble with trade unionism is there isn't enough of it. And why would he say something like that, a man who had no interest in working class people? Because he understood the role that the trade unions were playing in bringing working class people to die on the fields of France and in an imperialist war. That was the function they played. And ever since, that's the function they've played in sort of, getting working class people to sort of accept the nature of the capitalist system in which they lived. Simple as that. If you want to talk about racism, and people have, the racism that we all experienced in the 1970s and into the 1980s, and the residues of which still remain, was not propounded by Tories, as is often presented, because Tories never had the ear of working class people, maybe a few around the military families and so on, but the racism that infected British society came from the labour movement, claiming these immigrants are coming in here, taking your jobs, lowering your wages and so forth, and associating the immigrants with that process. That was the role of the Labour Party and the trade union movement. And I joined it in the National Union of Railwaymen, and when it became the RMT under the late deceased Bob Crow, the so-called radical, and I saw exactly all of that throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. It hadn't changed. It still hasn't changed. And the best thing that could happen was that all this movement would be consigned to the dustbin of history and we could build something new.
Well, stick that in your pipe, Paul. Thank you very much, Dennis. Paul, that's the end of the conversation. We finished on a high there. Do you want to come back and tackle some of these points? Like I say, you can't do everything, and we're running out of time.
No,
but,
I'll take your instruction. I'll pick and choose what I think are the best ones to come back on. So forgive me, anyone, if I don't come to your point. The question about are there any Labour MPs who are kind of following any sort of blue Labour agenda or the one that I articulate in the book. There are a very small number, I think, who get it, are not necessarily articulating it in an unvarnished way at the moment. I think possibly because some of the reaction they would get across the PLP and the wider movement. But someone like John Cruddas, for example, who by coincidence is the MP for Dagenham and Rainham, is someone quite close to the blue Labour tradition, I think, and somebody, especially coming, from a constituency like Dagenham, who has seen firsthand why the arguments that the likes of Iron Blue Labour have articulated ought to have some resonance within the wider party. I think before she stood down at the last election, Gloria De Piero was good at articulating some of this stuff, even to a certain degree, although I don't share many of his politics. Even Stephen Kinnock has started to argue the case for why Labour needs to take more of a communitarian and less of a cosmopolitan outlook towards its politics. The question: can we recognise? Can we reconcile the two wings? The younger, more kind of liberal progressive wing, and the older, more small C conservative wing of the movement. I think it's possible, and in fact, it's been done before, and Labour has succeeded when it's been able to bring those two wings of the movement together, the Hampsteads and the Hartlepols. What I simply say in the book is it's almost now a reverse of the position that we were in the 90s, because when Blair took over in 94, he went to the Labour movement and said, look, we've been out of power for 15 years, and the only way we're going to, we went off to the fringes in the 80s. The only way we're going to win power again is by appealing to Middle England, appealing to a larger swathe of middle-class voters. And that means we have to kind of ditch some of the old cloth cap politics, and we have to kind of reach out to the Tories in the shires. I think he was right in some ways. I think he was wrong in some ways. But, the reality is now it's almost the reverse of that process that needs to take place. It's, if you like, the more liberal middle class element of the party, which makes up most of the party, that now needs to accommodate the old working class, the old industrial working class. It's they who now need to make the concessions in order to bring the working class back on board. And only if they do that is the Labour Party ever going to be successful again, in my view. Why does the liberal left or the left hate the working class? I think somebody said. I think it's the fact that many among the working class who would still, I think, regard themselves as on the left politically in a vague sort of sense. I don't think many working class people see things in that defined left-right way, but associate possibly with the left in a loose sense, and felt once upon a time tribally Labour. Once there was no incompatibility between believing in the Labour values of, you know, a fairer economy, redistribution of wealth, tackling regional inequalities, trade unionism, a decent minimum wage, etc. But also having what, you know, some people would describe as those small C attitudes around such things as patriotism and law and order and family, and that kind of thing. Nowadays, I think the left sees those people as museum pieces, because it just instinctively, large parts of it views those sorts of beliefs as instinctively reactionary and bigoted. And the two, just very quickly, the two obvious examples, I think, were the incident with Gordon Brown and Gillian Duffy, where he called her a bigoted old woman simply because she expressed, in not terribly intemperate terms, by the way, some of the concerns over the impact of immigration in her community. And the absolutely bizarre spectacle of Emily Thornberry when she was at the Rochester by-election and saw a white van with a St George's flag, and clearly thought that this was so noteworthy that it was worth tweeting a photo of it with the caption "image from Rochester." I think those, I mean, of course, they both apologised, but actually what they displayed is, I think, the very innate feeling that large parts of the liberal left do genuinely feel towards working class people who might display the national flag, drive a white van, or who might express concerns over immigration. So I think it's a cultural thing in many respects, that there's a belief among large parts of the left that they're imbued with the principles of the Enlightenment, and that most working class people kind of have to be dragged out of their ignorance of their kind of attachment to place and belonging and all that kind of social conservative belief in nation and family, etc. The point about PR, someone asked about PR. I'm not persuaded by it. That's all I can say. I mean, I kind of believe in that intrinsic link between the Member of Parliament and the local constituency. I like the idea that there's a named Member of Parliament who people can elect and people can put a crossfire, or if they want to kick out, they get the ability to do that. I'm not sure that a PR system would maintain that link. I think it's, you know, you move across to a party list system where there isn't that intrinsic link, and things are managed much more in terms of candidates by the party machine. And I think the electorate have less say in that kind of system. I do know, because I've had the debate with people, that there are arguments against it, some of which I think are credible. I'm just not persuaded by it. I'll just make the final point, because I can't cover everything. I know in terms of America, I think that certainly the Dems lost large parts of the Rust Belt because I think of very similar reasons that the Labour Party lost post-industrial Britain. In fact, I do think there's quite a heavy crossover between the two scenarios. I think the danger for the left and for the Labour Party in Britain is if they look at Joe Biden's victory and the Democrats' victory, and they say, actually, Trump was an aberration, the Tories winning the Red Wall is going to be an aberration as well. We just need to hold the line. The working class will come back to their senses and vote for us again. Actually, I don't think that's going to happen. I think that there's a real danger in believing that to be true. I think unless Labour undergoes the kind of radical overhaul that is necessary, and the change in focus and the change in language that is necessary, then the working class are not going to flock back to it. And it would be naive in the extreme, I think, to believe it would.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. That was a cracking roundup, tackling some of the harder questions as well as some of the ones fed to you. But I mean, look, my final point I would make. I mean, I'm no Labour supporter. I'm certainly no Tory supporter. As a matter of fact, the only ever time I voted in my entire life, which is quite a long life, is in the Brexit referendum. And I just think it's kind of interesting what some people have raised about attracting people to a party which you already know is not actually doing the things that you wanted to do. And for me, I mean, I'm not having a go at you, but the argument is a bit like Paul Mason or Yanis Varoufakis and Owen Jones, all those people who were critical of the European Union, and yet when push came to shove, kind of endorsed it and supported it. And you felt as if they were selling you a pup, or they didn't have the courage of their convictions. And that, in some ways, at least the despondency. I think Daniel's question about the difference between 2000 and the examples you're giving about half the number of white working class moved out of Dagenham at that period. Obviously, you were saying that it's got about speed of change, about the shock of the new and all the rest of it. But as Daniel was saying, if you go back post-war, even before that, when they were building the Beacon Tree estate, and there was tremendous upheaval, Harlow Newtown, all these things were fundamental kind of shakes to their system, massive influx of new people, but it was seen in a much more positive way, wasn't it? That kind of post-war agenda that the future was a good place to be, whereas in some ways today there's a despondency about that, and that Brexit moment, which gave people a little bit of hope that their views and their ambitions and their vote would be respected, somehow is kind of being stamped upon. So, and that's been done by the Labour Party. That's part of the problem. Jeremy Corbyn gentrified the party, let's be honest, and brought all those kind of middle class people in who then he had to go with the Remain vote. I just think that idea about undermining the general consensus has lent to the party this distance from ordinary people's concerns. As it happens, there's somebody doing in the chat here, Niall Crowley, who's involved in local council, that local democracy, rebuilding from the beginning, not from a party, but almost from an independent starting point, taking your parochial point, but with vision, is actually quite an interesting starting point for maybe starting something new and inquiring about it. He's challenging low traffic neighborhoods within London where people are blocking roads and stopping people driving. So I just think that there is a potential here, and we can't let the gains of Brexit dissipate. But I kind of sneaky feeling that I think Labour Party might and stamp on it. That's my biggest worry. So that said, you're not going to have a right reply what I just said. I'm going to say that you say in the book somewhere, we need a brutally honest conversation that isn't dominated by cliche and recrimination, which I think is a fantastic summing up of your book and the ambitions behind it. So I applaud you for that, for taking the time to come and speak to us. And we're going to sell lots more of your books on your behalf. So you can't say further than that. So final round of applause, if you would please, everyone, for Paul, for a cracking turnout. Thank you very much indeed, man.
Thank you, everyone. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was great, and you know, to see so many people and so many excellent contributions. And I've just been reading the chat as well. Yeah, it's been a really good hour and a half or so. Thank you.
Thank you.